Welcome to In Focus with Ijaz Haider. Our top story tonight is about Afghanistan. The newly appointed U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has indicated that President Joe Biden intends to review the peace deal signed with the Taliban last year. According to the National Security Council spokeswoman, Washington wants to check that the Taliban is living up to its commitments to cut ties with terrorist groups, to reduce violence in Afghanistan, and to engage in meaningful negotiations with the Afghan government and other stakeholders. Sullivan also underscored that the U.S. will support the peace process with a robust and regional diplomatic effort which will aim to help the two sides achieve a durable and just political settlement and permanent ceasefire. For their part, the Taliban say they remain committed to the deal. We expect the other side to remain committed to the agreement too. This was Mohammad Naeem, the group's spokesman in Qatar, speaking with AFP news agency. The intra-Afghan talks remain stuck on a central issue. The Afghan government negotiating team insists that a ceasefire must be a priority in the talks, while the Taliban want discussion of a ceasefire to come after an agreement on the shape of a future government. Meanwhile, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi called on Biden to follow up on the ongoing Afghan peace process and U.S. troop withdrawal from the country. I think they, and he was referring to the Biden administration, should realize there is an opportunity in Afghanistan and they should persevere with what was initiated and not reverse things. Qureshi was speaking with Al Jazeera last Thursday. To discuss this further, we have with us Tehmina Janjua, a former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, and Mariam Wardak, an Afghan journalist and activist. Let me begin with Ambassador Janjua here. Ambassador Janjua, I quoted from what the Foreign Minister said, but one of the things that we have also been saying, and correct me if I am wrong, that the U.S. should go for a withdrawal which preconditions the fact that there is peace and some kind of peace agreement or a power-sharing agreement between the Taliban and the other stakeholders. So what exactly is Minister Qureshi referring to when he talks about the withdrawal timeline and for the U.S. to remain committed to it?
Thank you. Obviously, there are significant statements that have come out of Washington from the National Security Advisor as well as the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken. Firstly, Mr. Blinken has also referred to, we want to end this so-called forever war, which refers to the same thing that Pakistan has been saying that the Afghan people want as well, i.e. the end to this very long war. Of course, what Shah Mahmood Qureshi Sahib is saying is basically seeing how that there has been progress made in some of the discussions in the inter-Afghan dialogue. It's of course up to the Afghan people and the Afghan government and the Taliban representatives to chalk that out, to see how the movement in this process can be. But it's important to, as far as Pakistan is concerned, to say that there has been some progress. Yes, it was expected that the review would take place, considering that there have been comments that were made in the past by the President-elect Biden's team and now President Biden's team on the points that have been raised by Mr. Sullivan, i.e. to cut ties with the terrorists, according to the agreement with between the U.S. and the Taliban. There were three principal points that Mr. Sullivan's spokesperson has referred to, i.e. to cut ties with terrorist groups. And this, the Taliban have very categorically said that they have done so and they will continue to do so. Of course, the situation on ground continues to be difficult as far as reducing of violence is concerned. Pakistan categorically wants an end to violence in Afghanistan because any violence in Afghanistan also has an effect on Pakistan. And the final point is to engage in a meaningful negotiation with the Afghan government, that is, the Taliban is expected to do according to the agreement. And yes, our understanding is that the discussions are going on. There are points on which there would be differences, and I'm sure Ms. Wardak will also be referring to it, i.e. the role of rights of women, of minorities, and many such points. As far as Pakistan is concerned, we strongly support the importance of rights of women, of minorities, and the importance of having a democratic state in Afghanistan. But we would want that, if possible, the new government the new administration in Washington continue on to build on the work that has been done over the past 1 year. And one of the examples of this commitment is that Mr. Khalilzad will continue to remain at the front of all discussions, to be the lead person. As far as the timelines are concerned about withdrawal, the timelines according to the agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban was total withdrawal by May 2021. Our concern is that there should be peace and security within Afghanistan before such a withdrawal takes place, and therefore those timelines may not be easy to fulfill at this point. Nevertheless, it's important that both sides remain focused on the negotiations, the ongoing negotiations. As far as Pakistan is concerned, we have categorically said it, that Pakistan can only be a facilitator, and Pakistan does not want to be in a position where it's expected to take on a role larger than it can undertake. So most important for us, it's that a peace prevails in Afghanistan, because for us, in Pakistan, peace in Afghanistan is critical. On ending violence, we must also remember that within Afghanistan, it's not just the Taliban, but many such actors that continue to play a role. And that may also be, they may also be undertaking the violence aspect of it, which unfortunately has happened in the past 1 week with the killing of 2 women judges and a few other such attacks. As far as we also would want some kind of support remaining in Afghanistan with regard to counterterrorism operations, because terrorism must be addressed. And as far as Pakistan is concerned, we want to work with the Afghan government to ensure that India does not use Afghanistan to step up its terrorist activities vis-a-vis Pakistan. And of course, finally, as far as Pakistan is concerned, we would want to embrace Afghanistan in a mutually beneficial economic, cultural relationship, which is critical because it is important, because there are links between the two countries that cannot be denied. And of course, we hope that as time comes, our borders will become like European borders.
There are a couple of questions. I'll return to you, Ambassador Janjua, but let me pull in Mariam Wardak here. Mariam, what do you sense, what's the scope or scale or ambit of this review that the U.S. administration is now talking about, and about which Jake Sullivan spoke with Hamdullah Mohib? They had a telephonic conversation. Mohib ultimately tweeted about it also.
I think it's really important that the Afghan government boosts the morale of the Afghan people, especially in the sense of what's happening in the recent killings and assassinations. I think that the U.S. government is going to review it and also take Pakistan's perspective into it, is because of the longstanding relationship that Biden has had with Pakistan. Biden has not had very friendly relationships with Afghanistan. There has been 2 accounts where he has disrespectfully, abruptly left strategic dining discussion dinners with former President Hamid Karzai. I'm not sure how President Biden is going to continue to move forward with Afghanistan, but I really hope that he has advisors around him who are going to take into account the fact that the Afghan Taliban have not been upholding their aspect of it, the fact that there's assassinations and there are multiple groups that are pointing towards, including the Afghan government, pointing towards the Taliban, but there has been no claim. We're continuing to fight ISIS. So the fact that the U.S. troops want to leave and leave the fighting to the Afghan national forces in order to combat ISIS, it doesn't make any strategic sense to me. Not to mention that when there is reintegration of the Afghan Taliban, that is if it happens, then those soldiers that want to continue to fight will join ISIS or any other criminal groups that are active in Afghanistan or terrorist groups, because we all know that there are over 27 terrorist groups presently in Afghanistan. This is such a mess that I think it's not going to be as simple as it has been. I think that Ambassador Khalilzad has diplomatically taken certain conversations forward, but on the ground, there has been no change. The only change that I have witnessed is the fear that has spread so quickly amongst the citizens, where I feel that there's going to be another huge refugees leaving from Afghanistan. So these are the aspects that I think that we should take into consideration. We can have all these discussions with any former or current political actors, but in reality, the violence is very prominent in every province in Afghanistan.
Yes, I completely agree with you. You and I have discussed this aspect repeatedly on this program. But I'm happy you talked about the timeline. That was my question to Ambassador Janjua also. The reason I'm asking this question is because if you look at the original deal, which was signed on 29 February, immediately after that deal in March, the intra-Afghan dialogue was supposed to begin, but it did not. It got delayed by almost 6 months. Now, the original withdrawal timeline, which was made 2021, was based on the expectation that the intra-Afghan dialogue would begin in March, which, as I said, did not. So is it possible, or do you think it would be acceptable if President Biden were to involve the regional state actors, that's China, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, Russia, and say, okay, let's recalibrate the withdrawal timeline. As a matter of fact, this is an idea that's also been put out by Barnett Rubin in one of his recent articles. Is that something that do you think the Taliban would bite?
Bringing in regional actors has reiterated several times, and we should also look at the aspect that regional actors have been a part of both sides. Both sides meaning they're engaged with the Afghan Taliban and they're engaged with the Afghan government. And in that sense, I don't think that this helps the talks very well. Just recently, there was documents leaked in the newspaper of the Chinese agents that were in Afghanistan, and followed by that, it was how much China has been engaging with the Afghan Taliban and many other discussions. I don't know how much more helpful any of these actors could be. I think the prominent player here is Pakistan. I think Pakistan needs, United States is a close ally of Pakistan, it has been, and it seems that Biden is very close to Pakistan. I think Pakistan needs to push this aspect, not only push the aspects of discussion and to make sure that the United States stands to certain agreements and make sure that the other parties hold the agreements, but to continue the security in Afghanistan. Lastly, most importantly, Pakistan should also look into their own home and make sure that Afghans or Afghan Taliban or any insurgent groups hold no safe havens in Pakistan or any other connection to any other groups that can turn our region into an unstable security threat for the rest of the world.
On the issue of safe havens, right now the problem is more on the Afghan side with lots of these TTP and their affiliated terrorist groups using the Afghan soil. But let me go back to Ambassador Janjua. Ambassador Janjua, there is one, of course, as I said, the recalibration of the withdrawal timeline. If that is something which we would want, we meaning Pakistan. And secondly, as I said in my opening, there is the central issue of the Kabul government wanting a reduction in violence and a ceasefire, and the Taliban saying, well, that's going to come once we have agreed on a power sharing formula. Now, with reference to that power sharing formula, we know that President Ghani and his close, lieutenants are completely opposed to any kind of interim government. And President Ghani has made it very clear repeatedly that he intends to complete his term. So give me a sense of that also, whether that interim arrangement is something that is workable.
Let me just step back a bit and refer to the safe havens issue that you've also referred to. The reality is that as far as Pakistan is concerned, unfortunately, a number of terrorist acts that have taken place in Pakistan are the result of support from within Afghanistan, and that is an issue that we continue to discuss with our Afghan brothers and partners, and also we'll continue to bring this to the attention of the Americans as well, because Ms. Wardak has referred to the 27 terrorist individuals and organizations who are present in Afghanistan. These are a cause of great concern for Pakistan as well, and especially the presence of ISIS in Afghanistan, which its continued presence has created problems within Pakistan as well. So obviously, as far as the timelines are concerned, and your point about recalibration is concerned, we will also have to take into account that the intra-Afghan talks or negotiations have been not that smooth and not that easy, and this was expected because the Taliban and the Afghan government have been at different sides of the so-called conflict as such in Afghanistan. The recalibration may be required, taking into account that there has been a delay in the implementation or in the inter-Afghan negotiations as well. And therefore, the timelines that we are looking at, that were being looked at as May 2021 for complete withdrawal, may not be that easy. Secondly, there has been discussions on replacement of the U.S. side taking on the CT Act, the counterterrorism work within Afghanistan, and that is a requirement as far as Pakistan is concerned as well, because if there are 27 terrorist organizations and the ISIS that's blooming, so to say, in Afghanistan, then
we are gonna. I just understand. So we're gonna welcome a counterterrorism, operational presence of the United States.
You see, to so categorically say that we will welcome a counterterrorism operations role for the U.S. in Afghanistan is perhaps one should avoid that. But in any case, what is important is that the U.S. has to continue to have some kind of a presence in Afghanistan to deal with all these terrorist organizations. You referred earlier to the regional players. The regional players have, it's not just Pakistan, but it's Afghanistan, it's Iran, it's China, it's Russia that have played a role. And as far as Ms. Wardak referred to some papers on how China was working with the Taliban. Everyone has been working with the Taliban to try and end the conflict in Afghanistan. There were several mechanisms that were in place in which the US, the Russians, the Chinese participated in having some kind of conversations with the Taliban. The objective at the end of the day was to end the war in Afghanistan, end the violence in Afghanistan, and hence the role of the regional players, Iran as well, is important in trying to work out and have peace in Afghanistan, because at the end of the day, these 27 terrorist organizations, etc., that are in Afghanistan are threaten everyone in the region.
Right. So much. That was Ambassador Tehmina Janjua speaking with us. Let me go back to Mariam Wardak. So, Mariam, once again, I'm stressing this because it seems to me that this is one of those issues where talks are likely to make shipwreck and the issue of getting to some kind of power sharing formula. Now, as I said to Ambassador Janjua also, President Ashraf Ghani is obviously completely opposed to it. However, there is evidence that the Taliban are in talks with the political opposition in Kabul, with including former President Hamid Karzai and others, Dostum and various others. And more people, in terms of the political opposition, are looking at the idea of an interim government favorably. So, since you look at these issues very closely, could you tell us how this is likely to unfold? What kind of traction it will get with ultimately with the political opposition, and how far will that isolate President Ashraf Ghani, and also, as far as this particular point is concerned, Dr. Abdullah?
Let's reflect on President Ghani's current political actions. Recently, he had appointed one of his major opposition, former Vice President Khalili. He has still given certain other opposition leaders more symbolic positions. He is trying to be extra careful in his political moves, but however, there is a dissatisfaction in certain aspects of the Afghan government. This is where the Afghan Taliban are trying to play their card strong. They're reaching out and welcoming any outreach from any political opposition. From my perspective, I think it's wrong. I think anyone who has served and continues or serve the Afghan government needs to play on the side of the Republic. I think that having holding negotiations will, of course, bring us to some sort of power sharing. It is a huge institution that the Afghan government is currently fighting. What will happen? Currently, majority of the places that the Afghan Taliban are covering land-wise are empty, but they do hold some sort of popular public support. Why do I say that? For most of the attacks that are taking place, especially in major cities like Kabul, they have information and are housed in certain locations with the support of the public. I am very concerned for what the future will hold. I think that the fact that people are not that the Afghan government is not directly speaking to the people, I think our negotiation team, besides of like 3 or 4 individuals, are quite weak and can't uphold those discussions. And this might lead to another calamity. Again, all of this will be President Biden's responsibility. It is the United States that has entered the Afghan grounds when they were looking for Osama bin Laden. It was the United States that discussed and created wrong individuals to hold major power shares, such as Dostum and other leaders. So President Biden should really reflect on this process and make sure all parties uphold their responsibilities.
Right. Thank you so much, Mariam Wardak, speaking with us. I'm also joined by RahimUllah Yusufzai, a resident editor of the news in Peshawar. Mr. Yusufzai, thank you as always. This narrative that's now coming out of Washington, D.C. with reference to a review of the peace deal by the Biden administration. Give me your sense of what do you think this actually means?
I wasn't surprised by this because, we have been saying that like every new U.S. administration, they carry out a review of all the major issues and policies, especially because, a different party is now in power. And the previous president, had a reputation of being very unpredictable and impulsive. This, Taliban-U.S. peace agreement signed in February last year, even I remember at that time, Mike Pompeo had admitted that there were some secret clauses to the agreement, which were never made public. And I don't think that the Biden administration were told about it. They had been complaining that Trump was not cooperating in the transition process. So I think they will like to have a review, look at the agreement, look at the commitments made by the U.S. and Taliban, and then see whether the Taliban are meeting those commitments. I think this was a demand being also made by the Afghan government. In fact, their Senate wanted the whole peace agreement to be scrapped. So there will be a review. But I don't expect that the talks, would be stopped, that the agreement will be scrapped. I think the agreement will remain intact. The Biden administration would like maybe some amendments, like keeping a small counter-terrorism force in Afghanistan, like Taliban reducing violence, like progress being made in the intra-Afghan dialogue. That these kind of things would be taken up. But I think this cannot happen, say, from one side. Taliban would also have their complaints and they will also demand concessions. So there could be some renewed negotiations, but I don't expect any major changes in the peace agreement.
Right. Now, on this thing about, sort of tweaking this, before you joined us, I was talking to the other panelists, and I said that the original agreement, which was signed on 29th February, intended the intra-Afghan dialogue to start in March. But as we know, that dialogue did not start in March. It got delayed by almost 6 months. And the May 2021 full withdrawal timeline was actually based on the original agreement and the expectation that the intra-Afghan dialogue will begin in March, which it did not. Now, given that, is there a possibility that in the review, President Biden might want to recalibrate the withdrawal timeline? And if that is the case, do you think the Taliban would agree?
Yes, I think that's a very pertinent, point, because there was a delay because of the dispute over the exchange of prisoners. President Ashraf Ghani refusing to release them by arguing that his government was not part of the peace agreement and negotiations. But we still have time, and also we have to keep in mind that only 2,500 U.S. soldiers are now left in Afghanistan. Yes, there are maybe about 11,000 soldiers from the other NATO countries. There are also these so-called, contractors who are about 18,000. They are also there, who are protecting the U.S. military bases and supply lines. So, all of them have to leave according to the agreement signed in Doha. So I thought there were about 30,000 foreign troops before this latest, pullout by the Americans. So we still have a lot of force there, and they can be used by the Americans, to counter terrorists like Daesh, or even to keep a check on the Taliban, because there have been at least 2 or 3 airstrikes by the Americans whenever the Afghan government came under pressure and whenever Taliban intended to launch a big operation against the Afghan government forces. So that is one thing, but it is possible, Taliban may agree, because if there is, say, this, 5.5 months delay is kept in view, maybe it will be logical to delay the complete withdrawal. But if they are able to make progress in the peace talks, then it can happen on time.
Right. Thank you, sir. That was RahimUllah Yusufzai speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss U.S. President Joe Biden's conversation with French President Emmanuel Macron on the Iran nuclear deal. Stay with us. Welcome Welcome back to In Focus. Our closing segment tonight is about the phone conversation between U.S. President Joe Biden and French President Emmanuel Macron on the Iran nuclear deal. According to reports, the two agreed Sunday to coordinate on Middle East peace issues and the Iran deal. Biden has indicated his desire to return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as the deal is known, while Israel, the closest U.S. ally in the Middle East, has been pushing for any return to the agreement to include fresh limitations on Iran's ballistic missile program and Iran's support for what Tel Aviv calls terror and destabilization around the world. Last September, in an article for CNN, Biden had said, and I quote from that article, "I will offer Tehran a credible path back to diplomacy if Iran returns to strict compliance with the nuclear deal. The United States would rejoin the agreement as a starting point for follow-on negotiations," unquote. Starting point for follow-on negotiations seems to be the catchphrase here. If it's what Israel wants, or what had also been indicated by the Trump administration, what would be new? Is Biden offering Iran the carrot of the U.S. rejoining the deal and lifting the secondary sanctions before getting down to negotiating additional areas of concern with Iran? Would Iran bite? Many questions. To discuss this, I'm joined by Herszenhorn, Chief Brussels Correspondent for Politico, and Tohid Asadi, a PhD candidate of American Studies at the University of Tehran. Thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with David Herszenhorn here. David, it's interesting. I mean, there seems to be some kind of, shall I say, conflicting signals coming our way. For instance, Avril Haines, during her confirmation hearing, said, in response to a question with reference to Iran, she said, frankly, we are a long ways from that. And she also said, we'll have to look at the ballistic missile issues. Then Antony Blinken also, during one of the hearings, made similar comments. We're a long way from there. And then Jen Psaki also echoed these remarks. So give us a sense of what exactly is happening here.
Well, what you're seeing is a challenge as Biden thinks about returning to the Iran nuclear deal of sequencing. We know President Rouhani has tried to say that the ball is served to Washington, that it's Washington's move first. I would point, as you were picking up on, what's the key phrase there? To me, the key phrase is if Iran returns to compliance. Washington and Biden are looking for Iran to go first. This has always been a challenge within the JCPOA. So now we know that Trump, in pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, reimposed sanctions. We know Tehran is going to want to see those sanctions dropped before it makes its move and returns to compliance. Meanwhile, as you say, the Biden foreign policy team making very clear that they see this as a ways off. I think that's because what they would like to see is for Iran first, in a gesture of good faith, to return to compliance on its side. So what we have is a bit of a standoff, I expect, in the next weeks and months, where each side says they want to return to the deal, but in fact, neither side wants to be the one to go first because there's such a deficit and lack of trust. This is the big challenge.
I agree. Sequencing can be a major problem. In the previous segment, actually, we were talking about Afghanistan, and one of the issues that came up was about sequencing. The Taliban saying, well, we first want the power sharing agreement before we, get to a ceasefire, and the Kabul government saying, no, we need the reduction in violence and the ceasefire before we get there. So sequencing can be a problem. So in that case, it seems to me that President Biden's conversation with President Macron could also be significant with reference to the fact that France has been standing firmly behind the JCPOA. So is there a possibility that President Biden wants President Macron to somehow resolve this issue of sequencing?
It makes it very difficult. Obviously, President Macron, along with Prime Minister Boris Johnson or Chancellor Merkel of Germany, could try to suggest, and I don't think they will do this, they could try to suggest that the U.S. should go first. I think, in fact, side with Washington because they have expressed their own concerns about Iran resuming some of the uranium enrichment that we've seen in recent days. The reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency confirming that, in fact, Iran has stepped back from its commitments. So I would expect, for better or worse, that the European partners and guarantors of the JCPOA are going to support Washington in their position that it should be Iran and Tehran that have to move first in restoring trust here. Of course, Iran will be justified in saying, look, they weren't the ones who were first to pull out, so they shouldn't be the ones who have to be first to go back in. This is really a question of how long a standoff will this be. But given, as we've talked about before on your show, the pressure that Biden will be under within his own Congress, within his own government, from Israel, as you say, from folks who don't necessarily want the U.S. to go back into the JCPOA, it will be very hard for him to be the one to make the first move. So this is really the dilemma there. I'm not sure that Macron can even make the decision for Biden, even if that is what he wanted to do.
Right. And further muddying the waters is, of course, statements coming from Israel. For instance, Finance Minister Israel Katz talked about, there are disputes with Biden regarding the perspective on Iran, and of course that will prove challenging and the rest of it. But thank you so much. That was David Herszenhorn speaking with us. Let me get to Tohid Asadi here. Mr. Asadi, how do you look at the situation with reference to what President Biden said and what I quoted from his article that he wrote for CNN in September last year?
Frankly speaking, I think David, your other guest, was right. The key challenge that currently exists when it comes to Iran-U.S. relations is the serious lack of trust. But then again, if you take a look at the matter of sequencing, you should come up with this conclusion that this lack of trust comes from a clear lack of commitment. Just a quick check into the whole picture that we have had so far. We know that after rounds and hours of negotiations between Iran and P5+1, we had JCPOA signed and sealed as a UN Security Council resolution, but all of a sudden, after 2015 deal, we had the United States withdrawing from the deal, basically with no logical, legal reason behind it. And that caused a serious lack of trust for Iranians and even for those Iranians who supported and who were for, let's say, going through negotiations in order to resolve the problems. But currently speaking, the thing is that Biden has got this a golden opportunity of less than half a year, as long as President Rouhani has this chance to, let's say, be the president of Iran. Well, after that period, we know that nothing is clear. There is going to be another president, and whether or not Iran is willing to have negotiations with these countries stays kind of unclear. All in all, what I can say is that Iran, currently speaking, has got some clear statements pertaining to the matter. First of all, we are hearing from Iran that Tehran is looking for equality of actions, meaning that if the United States and its Western partners start to put out some nice statements but nothing in action, the reaction from Iranian side would be almost the same. And if they start to take some practical courses of action pertaining to the deal, then the result is going to be that Iran is going to follow the same trajectory in return. This is a very holistic picture. One last thing that I would like to add is Blinken's recent statements pertaining to Iran-U.S. relations. Well, Foreign Minister Zarif recently said that Iran is not going to renegotiate a deal that has been already negotiated. So when it comes to the United States intending to get back to the deal that they unilaterally withdraw, the key point of concern, I think, is that they should pay close attention to the very fact that it was a decision at that time made by both sides, I mean Iran on one hand and P5+1 on the other hand, to concentrate and to, let's say, focus their negotiations and their deal, a power nuclear program, and adding other, let's say, components to a, let's say, kind of unclear deal is not going to help fixing the problem. That's the whole thing that I can say about the whole situation that exists currently.
Right. So there's many a snag going forward, but thank you so much. That was Tohid Asadi speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.